Yet another effort, Frenchmen, if you would become Republicans. Religion. I am about to put forward some major ideas. They will be heard and pondered. If not all of them, please, surely a few will. In some sort, then, I shall have contributed to the progress of our age, and shall be content. We near our goal, but haltingly. I confess that I am disturbed by the presentiment that we are on the eve of failing once again to arrive there. Is it thought that goal will be attained when at last we have been given laws? Abandon the notion, for what should we, who have no religion, do with laws? We must have a creed befitting the republican character, something far removed from ever being able to resume the worship in Rome. In this age, when we are convinced that morals must be the basis of religion, and not the religion of morals, we need a body of beliefs in keeping with our customs and habits, something that would be their necessary consequence, and that could, by lifting up the spirit, maintain it perpetually at the high level of this precious liberty, which today the spirit has made its unique idol. Well, I ask, is it unthinkable that the doctrine of one of Titus's slaves, of a clumsy histrionic from Judea, befitting to a free and warlike nation that has just regenerated itself? No, my fellow countrymen, no. You think nothing of the sort. If, to his misfortune, the Frenchman were to entomb himself in the grave of Christianity, then on one side the priest pride, the tyranny, the despotism, vices forever cropping up in that impure horde. On the other side, the baseness, the narrowness, the platitudes of dogma and mystery of this infamous and fabulous religion would, by blunting the fine edge of the republican spirit, rapidly put about the Frenchman's neck the yoke which his vitality but yesterday shattered. Let us not lose sight of the fact that this puerile religion was among our tyrant's best weapons. One of its key dogmas was to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. However, we have dethroned Caesar. We are no longer disposed to render him anything. Frenchmen, it would be in vain were you to suppose that your oath-taking clergy today is in any essential manner different from yesterday's non-juring clergy. There are inherent vices beyond all possibility of correction. Before 10 years are out, utilizing the Christian religion, its superstitions, its prejudices, your priests, their pledges notwithstanding, and though despoiled of their riches, are sure to reassert their empire over the souls they shall have undermined and captured. They shall restore the monarchy, because the power of the kings has always reinforced that of the church, and your republican edifice, its foundations eaten away, shall collapse. Oh, you who have axes ready to hand, deal the final blow to the tree of superstition. Be not content to prune its branches. Uproot entirely a plant whose effects are so contagious. Well understand that your system of liberty and equality too rudely affronts the ministers of Christ's altars for there ever to be one of them who will either adopt it in good faith or give over seeking to topple it, if he is able to recover any dominion over consciences. What priest, comparing the condition to which he has been reduced with the one he formerly enjoyed, will not do his utmost to win back both the confidence and the authority he has lost? And how many feeble and pusillanimous creatures will not speedily become again the thralls of the cunning shave pate? Why is it imagined that the nuisances which existed before cannot be revived to plague us anew? In the Christian Church's infancy, were priests less ambitious than they are today? You observe how far they advanced. To what do you suppose they owe the success, if not to the means religion furnished them? Well, if you do not absolutely prohibit this religion, those who preach it, having yet the same means, will soon achieve the same ends. Then annihilate forever what may one day destroy your work. Consider that the fruit of your labors being reserved for your grandchildren only, duty and probity command that you bequeath them none of those seeds of disaster which could mean for your descendants a renewal of the chaos whence we have with so much trouble just emerged. At the present moment, our prejudices are weakening. The people have already abjured the Catholic absurdities. They have already suppressed the temples, sent the relics flying, and agreed that marriage is a mere civil undertaking. The smashed confessionals serve as public meeting places. The former faithful, deserting the apostolic banquet, leave the gods of flour dough to the mice. Frenchmen, an end to your waverings. All of Europe, one hand halfway raised to the blindfold over her eyes, expects that effort by which you must snatch it from her head. Make haste. Holy Rome strains every nerve to repress your vigor. Hurry, lest you give Rome time to secure her grip upon the few proselytes remaining to her. Unsparingly and recklessly smite off her proud and trembling head. And before 2 months the tree of liberty, overshadowing the wreckage of Peter's chair, will soar victoriously above all the contemptible Christian vestiges and idols raised with such effrontery over the ashes of Cato and Brutus. Frenchmen, I repeat it to you, Europe awaits her deliverance from scepter and censor alike. Know well that you cannot possibly liberate her from royal tyranny without at the same time breaking for her the fetters of religious superstition. The shackles of the one are too intimately linked to those of the other. Let one of the two survive, and you cannot avoid falling subject to the other you have left intact. It is no longer before the knees of either an imaginary being or a vile impostor a republican must prostrate himself. His only gods must now be courage and liberty. Rome disappeared immediately Christianity was preached there, and France is doomed if she continues to revere it. Let the absurd dogmas, the appalling mysteries, the impossible morality of this disgusting religion be examined with attention, and it will be seen whether it befits a republic. Do you honestly believe I would allow myself to be dominated by the opinion of a man I had just seen kneeling before the idiot priest of Jesus? No, certainly not. That eternally base fellow will eternally adhere, by dint of the baseness of his attitudes, to the atrocities of the Ancien regime. As of the moment he were able to submit to the stupidities of a religion as abject as the one we are mad enough to acknowledge, he is no longer competent to dictate laws or transmit learning to me. I no longer see him as other than a slave to prejudice and superstition. To convince ourselves, we have but to cast our eyes upon the handful of individuals who remain attached to our fathers' insensate worship We will see whether they are not all irreconcilable enemies of the present system. We will see whether it is not amongst their numbers that all of that justly contemned caste of royalists and aristocrats is included. Let the slave of a crowned brigand grovel, if he pleases, at the feet of a plaster image. Such an object is ready-made for his soul of mud. He who can serve kings must adore gods. But we, Frenchmen, my fellow countrymen, we, rather than once more crawl beneath such contemptible traces, we would die 1,000 times over rather than abase ourselves anew. Since we believe a cult necessary, let us imitate the Romans. Actions, passions, heroes. Those were the objects of their respect. Idols of this sort elevated the soul, electrified it, and more, they communicated to the spirit the virtues of the respected being. Minerva's devotee coveted wisdom. Courage found its abode in his heart who worshipped Mars. Not a single one of that great people's gods was deprived of energy. All of them infused into the spirit of him who venerated them the fire with which they were themselves ablaze. And each Roman hoped someday to be himself worshipped. Each aspired to become as great, at least as the deity he took for a model. But what, on the contrary, do we find in Christianity's futile gods? What? I want to know, what does this idiot's religion offer you? Does this grubby Nazarene fraud inspire any great thoughts in you? His foul, nay, repellent mother, the shameless Mary, does she excite any virtues? And do you discover in the saints who garnish the Christian Elysium any example of greatness, of either heroism or virtue? So alien to lofty conceptions is this miserable belief that no artist can employ its attributes in the monuments he raises, even in Rome itself. Most of the embellishments of the papal palaces have their origins in paganism, and as long as this world shall continue, paganism alone will arouse the verve of great men. Shall we find more motifs of grandeur in pure theism? Will acceptance of a chimera infuse into men's minds the high degree of this energy essential to republican virtues, and move men to cherish and practice them? Let us imagine nothing of the kind. We have bid farewell to that phantom, and, at the present time, atheism is the one doctrine of all those prone to reason. As we gradually proceeded to our enlightenment, we came more and more to feel that, motion being inherent in matter, the prime mover existed only as an illusion, and that all that exists essentially having to be in motion, the motor was useless. We sense that this chimerical divinity, prudently invented by the earliest legislators, was, in their hands, simply one more means to enthrall us. And that, reserving unto themselves the right to make the phantom speak, they knew very well how to get him to say nothing but what would shore up the preposterous laws whereby they declared they served us. Lycurgus, Numa, Moses, Jesus Christ, Mohammed, all these great rogues, all these great thought tyrants, knew how to associate the divinities they fabricated with their own boundless ambition, and certain of captivating the people with the sanction of those gods. They were always studious, as everyone knows, either to consult them exclusively about, or to make them exclusively respond to what they thought likely to serve their own interests. Therefore, today let us equally despise both that empty god impostors have celebrated, and all the farce of religious subtleties surrounding a ridiculous belief. It is no longer with this bauble that free men are to be amused. Let the total extermination of cults and denominations therefore enter into the principles we broadcast throughout all Europe. Let us not be content with breaking scepters. We will pulverize the idols forever. There is never more than a single step away from superstition to royalism. Does anyone doubt it? Then let him understand once and for all that in every age one of the primary concerns of kings has been to maintain the dominant religion as one of the political bases that best sustains the throne. But since it is shattered, that throne, and since it is, happily, shattered for all time, let us not have the slightest qualm about also demolishing the thing that supplied its plinth. Yes, citizens, religion is incompatible with the libertarian system you have sensed as much. Never will a free man stoop to Christianity's gods. Never will its dogmas, its rites, its mysteries, or its morals suit a republican. One more effort. Since you labor to destroy all the old foundations, do not permit one of them to survive. For let but one endure. 'Tis enough. The rest will be restored. And how much more certain of their revival must we not be if the one you tolerate is positively the source and cradle of all the others? Let us give over thinking religion can be useful to man. Once good laws are decreed unto us, we will be able to dispense with religion. But, they assure us, the people stand in need of one. It amuses them. They are soothed by it. Fine. Then, if that be the case, give us religion proper to free men. Give us the gods of paganism. We shall willingly worship Jupiter, Hercules, Pallas, but we have no use for a dimensionless god who nevertheless fills everything with his immensity, an omnipotent god who never achieved what he wills, a supremely good being who creates malcontents only, a friend of order in whose government everything is in turmoil. No, we want no more of a god who is at loggerheads with nature, who is the father of confusion, who moves man at the moment man abandons himself to horrors. Such a god makes us quiver with indignation, and we consign him forever to the oblivion, whence the infamous Robespierre wished to call him forth. Frenchmen, in the stead of that unworthy phantom, we will substitute the imposing simulacra that rendered Rome mistress of the earth. Let us treat every Christian image as we have the tokens of monarchy. There were once tyrants. Sat, we have mounted emblems of liberty. In like manner, we will place effigies of great men on the pedestals once occupied by statues of the knaves Christianity adored. Let us cease to entertain doubts as to the effect of atheism in the country. Have not the peasants felt the necessity of the annihilation of the Catholic cult, so contradictory to the true principles of freedom? Have they not watched, undaunted, and without sorrow or pain, their altars and presbyteries battered to bits? Ah, rest assured, they will renounce their ridiculous god in the same way. The statues of Mars, of Minerva, and of Liberty will set tip in the most conspicuous places in the villages. Holidays will be celebrated there every year. The prize will be decreed to the worthiest citizen. At the entrance to a secluded wood, Venus, Hymen, and Love, erected beneath a rustic temple, will receive lovers' homages. There, by the band of the Graces, beauty will crown constancy. More than mere loving will be required in order to pose one's candidacy for the tiara. It will be necessary to have merited love. Heroism, capabilities, humaneness, largeness of spirit, a proven civism. Those are the credentials the lover shall be obliged to present at his mistress's feet. And they will be of far greater value than the titles of birth and wealth a fool's pride used to require. Some virtues, at least, will be born of this worship, whereas nothing but crimes come of that other we had the weakness to profess. This worship will ally itself to the liberty we serve. It will animate, nourish, inflame liberty, whereas theism is, in its essence and in its nature, the most deadly enemy of the liberty we adore. Was a drop of blood spilled when the pagan idols were destroyed under the Eastern Empire? The revolution, prepared by the stupidity of a people become slaves again, was accomplished without the slightest hindrance or outcry. Why do we dread the work of philosophy as more painful than that of despotism? It is only the priests who still hold the people, whom you hesitate to enlighten, captive at the feet of their imaginary god. Take the priests from the people, and the veil will fall away naturally. Be persuaded that these people, a great deal wiser than you suppose them, once rid of tyranny's irons, will soon also be rid of superstitions. You are afraid of the people unrestrained. How ridiculous! Ah, believe me, citizens, the man not to be checked by the material sword of justice will hardly be halted by the moral fear of hell's torments, at which he has been laughed since childhood. In a word, many crimes have been committed as a consequence of your theism, but never has it prevented a single one. If it is true that passions blind, that their effect is to cloud our eyes to dangers to surround us, how may we suppose that those dangers which are remote, such as the punishments announced by your gods, can successfully dispel the cloud, not even the blade of the law itself, constantly suspended above the passions, is able to penetrate? If then it is patently clear that this supplementary check imposed by the idea of a god becomes useless, if it is demonstrated that by its other effects it is dangerous, then I wish to know, to what use can it be put? And from what motives should we lend our support in order to prolong its existence? Is someone about to tell me that we are not yet mature enough to consolidate our revolution in so brilliant a manner? Ha ha! My fellow citizens, the road we took in '89 has been much more difficult than the one still ahead of us, and we have little yet to do to conquer the opinion we have been harrying since the time of the overwhelming of the Bastille. Let us firmly believe that a people wise enough and brave enough to drag an impudent monarch from the heights of the grandeur to the foot of the scaffold, a people that, in these last few years, has been able to vanquish so many prejudices and sweep away so many ridiculous impediments, will be sufficiently wise and brave to terminate the affair and in the interests of the Republic's well-being, abolish a mere phantom after having successfully beheaded a real king. Frenchmen, only strike the initial blows. Your state education will then see to the rest. Get promptly to the task of training the youth. It must be amongst your most important concerns. Above all, build their education upon a sound ethical basis. The ethical basis that was so neglected in your religious education. Rather than fatigue your children's young orphans with deific stupidities, replace them with excellent social principles. Instead of teaching them futile prayers, which, by the time they are 16, they will glory in having forgotten, let them be instructed in their duties towards society. Train them to cherish the virtues you scarcely ever mentioned in former times, and which, without your religious fables, are sufficient for their individual happiness. Make them sense that this happiness consists in rendering others as fortunate as we desire to be ourselves. If you repose these truths upon Christian chimeras, as you so foolishly used to do, scarcely will your pupils have detected the absurd futility of its foundations, then they will overthrow the entire edifice. And they will become bandits for the simple reason they believe the religion they have toppled forbids them to be bandits. On the other hand, if you make them sense the necessity of virtue, uniquely because their happiness depends on it, egoism will turn them into honest people. And this law which dictates their behavior to men will always be the surest, the soundest of all. Let there, then, be the most scrupulous care taken to avoid mixing religious fantasies into the state education. Never lose sight of the fact it is free men we wish to form, not the wretched worshippers of a god. Let a simple philosopher introduce these new pupils to the inscrutable but wonderful sublimities of nature. Let him prove to them that awareness of a god, often highly dangerous to men, never contributed to their happiness, and that they will not be happier for acknowledging as a cause of what they do not understand something you will understand even less, that it is far less essential to inquire into the workings of nature than to enjoy her and obey her laws, that these laws are as wise as they are simple, that they are written in the hearts of all men, and that it is but necessary to interrogate that heart to discern its impulse. If they wish absolutely that you speak to them of a creator, answer that things always having been what now they are, never having had a beginning and never going to have an end, it that becomes as useless as impossible for man to be able to trace things back to an imaginary origin which would explain nothing and do not a jot of good. Tell them that men are incapable of obtaining true notions of a being who does not make his influence felt on one of our senses. All our ideas are representations of objects that strike us. What is to represent to us the idea of a god, who is plainly an idea without object? Is not such an idea, you will add when talking to them, quite as impossible as effects without causes? Is an idea without prototype anything other than a hallucination? Some scholars, you will continue, assure us that the idea of a god is innate, and that mortals already have this idea within their mothers' bellies. But you will remark that is false. Every principle is a judgment, every judgment the outcome of experience, and experience is only acquired by the exercise of the senses. Whence it follows that religious principles bear upon nothing whatever, and are not in the slightest innate. How, you will go on, How have they been able to convince rational beings that the thing most difficult to understand is the most vital to them? It is that mankind has been terrorized. It is that when one is afraid, one ceases to reason. It is, above all, that we have been advised to mistrust reason and defy it. And that, when the brain is disturbed, one believes anything and examines nothing. Ignorance and fear, you will repeat to them. Ignorance and fear, those are the twin bases of every religion. Man's uncertainty with respect to his God is precisely the cause for his attachment to his religion. Man's fear in dark places is as much physical as moral. Fear becomes habitual to him, and is changed into need. He would believe he were lacking something even were he to have nothing more to hope for or dread. Next, return to the utilitarian value of morals. Apropos of this vast subject, give them many more examples and lessons, many more demonstrations and books, and you will make good citizens of them. You will turn them into fine warriors, fine fathers, fine husbands. You will fashion men much more devoted to their country's liberty, whose minds will be forever immune to servility, forever hostile to servitude, whose genius will never be troubled by any religious terror. And then true patriotism will shine in every spirit, and will reign there in all its force and purity, because it will become the sovereign sentiment there, and no alien notion will dilute or cool its energy. Then your second generation will be sure, reliable, and your own work, consolidated by it, will go on to become the law of the universe. But if, through fear or faint-heartedness, these counsels are ignored, if the foundations of the edifice we thought we destroyed are left intact, what then will happen? They will rebuild upon these foundations, and will set thereupon the same colossi, with this difference, that it will be a cruel one. The new structures will be cemented with such strength that neither your generation nor ensuing ones will avail against them. Let there be no doubt of it. Religions are the cradles of despotism. The foremost amongst all the despots was a priest. The first king and the first emperor of Rome, Numa and Augustus, associated themselves, the one and the other, with the sacerdotal. Constantine and Clovis were rather abbots than sovereigns. Heliogabalus was priest of the sun. At all times, in every century, every age, there has been a connection between despotism and religion that is infinitely apparent and demonstrated 1,000 times over, that in destroying one, the other must be undermined, for the simple reason that the first will always put the law into the service of the second. I do not, however, propose either massacres or expulsions. Such dreadful things have no place in the enlightened mind. No, do not assassinate at all. Do not expel at all. These are royal atrocities, or the brigands who imitate kings. It is not at all by acting as they that you will force men to look with horror upon them who practice those crimes. Let us reserve the employment of force for the idols. Ridicule alone will suffice for those who serve them. Julian's sarcasm wrought great damage to Christianity than all Nero's tortures. Yes, we shall destroy for all time any notions of a god, and make soldiers of his priests. A few of them are already. Let them keep to this trade, soldiering, so worthy of a republican. But let them give us no more of the chimerical being, nor of his nonsense-filled religion, the single object of our scorn. Let us condemn the first of those blessed charlatans, who comes to us to say a few more words either of God or of religion. Let us condemn him to be jeered at, ridiculed, covered with filth in all the public square and marketplaces in France's largest cities. Imprisonment for life will be the reward of whosoever falls a second time into the same error. Let the most insulting blasphemy, the most atheistic works, next be fully and openly authorized, in order to complete the extirpation from the human heart and memory of those appalling pastimes of our childhood. Let there be put in circulation the writings most capable of finally illuminating the Europeans upon a matter so important, and let a considerable prize, to be bestowed by the nation, be awarded to him, having said and demonstrated everything upon this score, will leave to his countrymen no more than a scythe to mow the land clean of all those phantoms, and a steady heart to hate them. In 6 months the whole will be done. Your infamous God will be as naught, and all that without ceasing to be just, jealous of the esteem of others without ceasing to be honest men. For it will have been sensed that the real friend of his country must in no way be led about by chimeras, as is a slave of kings. That it is not in a word either the frivolous hope of a better world, nor fear of the greatest ills nature sends us that must lead a republican, whose only guide is virtue, and whose one restraint is conscience. Manners. After having made it clear that theism is in no wise suitable to republican government, it seems to me necessary to prove that French manners are equally unsuitable to it. This article is the more crucial, while the laws will be promulgated, will issue from manners, and will mirror them. Frenchmen, you are too intelligent to fail to sense that new government will require new manners. That the citizens of a free state conduct themselves like a despotic king's slaves is unthinkable. The differences of their interests, of their duties, of their relations amongst one another essentially determine an entirely different manner of behaving in the world. A crowd of minor faults and of little social indelicacies, thought of as very fundamental indeed under the rule of kings whose expectations rose in keeping with the need they felt to impose curbs in order to appear respectable and unapproachable to their subjects, are due to become as nothing with us. Other crimes with which we are acquainted under the names of regicide and sacrilege, in a system where kings and religion will be unknown, in the same way must be annihilated in a republican state. In according the freedom of conscience and of the press, consider, citizens, for it is practically the same thing, whether freedom of action must not be granted too. Excepting direct clashes with the underlying principles of government, there remains to you, it is impossible to say how many fewer crimes to punish. Because, in fact, there are very few criminal actions in a society whose foundations are liberty and equality. Matters well weighed, and things closely inspected, only that is really criminal which rejects the law. For nature, equally dictating vices and virtues to us, in reason of our constitution, yet more philosophically, in reason of the need nature has of the one and the other, what she inspires in us would become a very reliable gauge by which to adjust exactly what is good and bad. But, the better to develop my thoughts upon so important a question, We will classify the different acts in man's life that until the present it has pleased us to call criminal, and we will next square them to the true obligations of a republican. In every age, the duties of man have been considered under the following three categories. 1. Those his conscience and his credulity impose upon him, with what regards a supreme being. 2. Those he is obliged to fulfill toward his brethren. 3. Finally, those that relate only to himself. The certainty in which we must be that no god meddles in our affairs, and as thus, as necessary creatures of nature, like plants and animals, we are here because it would be impossible for us not to be. This unshakable certainty, it is clear enough, at one stroke erases the first group of duties, those, I wish to say, toward the divinity to which we erroneously believe ourselves beholden, and with them vanish all religious climes, all those comprehended under the indefinite names of impiety, sacrilege, blasphemy, atheism, etc., all those, in brief, which Athens so unjustly punished, and Alcibiades, and France, and the unfortunate Lebar. If there is anything extravagant in this world, it is to see men, in whom only shallowness of mind and poverty of ideas give rise to a notion of God, and to what this God expects of them, nevertheless wish to determine what pleases and what angers their imagination's ridiculous phantom. It would hence not be merely to tolerate indifferently each of the cults that I would like to see us limit ourselves. I should like there to be perfect freedom to deride them all. I should like men, gathered in no matter what temple to invoke the Eternal who wears their image, to be seen as so many comics in a theatre, at whose antics every one may go to laugh. Regarded in any other light, religions become serious, and then important once again. They will soon stir up and patronize opinions, and no sooner will people fall to disputing over religions than some will be beaten into favoring religions. Equality once wrecked by the preference or protection tendered one of them, the government will soon disappear, and out of the reconstituted theocracy the aristocracy will be reborn in a trice. I cannot repeat it to you all too often. No more gods, Frenchmen, no more gods, lest under their fatal influence you wish to be plunged back into all the horrors of despotism. But it is only by jeering that you will destroy them. All the dangers they bring in their wake will instantly be revived en masse if you pamper or ascribe any consequence to them. Carried away by anger, you overthrow their idols? Not for a minute. Have a bit of sport with them, and they will crumble to bits. Once withered, the opinion will collapse of its own accord. I trust I have said enough to make plain that no laws are to be decreed against religious crimes, for that which offends an illusion offends nothing, and it would be the height of inconsistency to punish those who outrage or who despise a creed or a cult whose priority to all others is established by no evidence whatsoever. No, that would necessarily be to exhibit a partiality, and, consequently, to influence the scales of equality, that foremost law of your new government. We move on to the second class of man's duties, those which bind him to his fellows. This is, of all classes, the most extensive. Excessively vague upon man's relations with his brothers, Christian morals propose bases so filled with sophistries that we are completely unable to accept them. Since, if one is pleased to erect principles, one ought scrupulously to guard against founding them upon sophistries. This absurd morality tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Assuredly, nothing would be more sublime, were it ever possible for what is false to be beautiful. The point is not at all to love one's brethren as oneself. since that is in defiance of all the laws of nature, and since hers is the sole voice which must direct all the actions in our life. It is only a question of loving others as brothers, as friends, given us by nature, and with whom we should be able to live much better in a republican state, wherein the disappearance of distances must necessarily tighten the bonds. May humanity, fraternity, benevolence prescribe our reciprocal obligations, and let us individually fulfill them with the simple decree of energy nature has given us to this end. Let us do so without blaming, and above all without punishing, those who, of chillier temper and more acrimonious humor, do not notice in these yet very touching social ties all the sweetness and gentleness others discover therein. For it will be agreed, to seek to impose universal laws would be a palpable absurdity. Such a proceeding would be as ridiculous as that of the general who would have all his soldiers dressed in a uniform of the same size. It is a terrible injustice to require that men of unlike character all be ruled by the same law. What is good for one is not at all good for another. That we cannot devise as many laws as there are men must be admitted, but the laws can be lenient, and so few in number, that all men, of whatever character, can easily observe them. Furthermore, I would demand that this small number of laws be of such a sort as to be adaptable to all the various characters. They who formulate the code should follow the principle of applying more or less, according to the person in question. It has been pointed out that there are certain virtues whose practice is impossible for certain men, just as there are certain remedies which do not agree with certain constitutions. Now, would it not be to carry your injustice beyond all limits were you to send the law to strike the man incapable of bowing to the law? Would your iniquity be any less here than in a case where you sought to force the blind to distinguish amongst colors? From these first principles there follows, one feels, the necessity to make flexible, mild laws, and especially to get rid forever of the atrocity of capital punishment, because the law which attempts a man's life is impractical, unjust, and inadmissible. Not, and it will be clarified in the sequel, that we lack an infinite number of cases where, without offense to nature, and this I shall demonstrate, men have freely taken one another's lives, simply exercising a prerogative received from their common mother. But it is impossible for the law to obtain the same privileges, since the law, cold and impersonal, is a total stranger to the passions which are able to justify in man the cruel act of murder. Man receives his impressions from nature, who is able to forgive him this act. The law, on the contrary, always opposed as it is to nature, and receiving nothing from her, cannot be authorized to permit itself the same extravagances. Not having the same motives, the law cannot have the same rights. Those are wise and delicate distinctions which escape many people, because very few of them reflect. But they will be grasped and retained by the instructed to whom I recommend them, and will, I hope, exert some influence upon the new code being readied for us. The second reason why the death penalty must be done away with is that it has never repressed crime. For crime is every day committed at the foot of the scaffold. This punishment is to be got rid of. In a word, because it would be difficult to conceive of a poorer calculation than this, by which a man is put to death for having killed another. Under the present arrangement, the obvious result is not one man the less, but of a sudden two. Such arithmetic is in use only amongst headsmen and fools. However, all that may be, the injuries we can work against our brothers may be reduced to 4 types: calumny, theft, the crimes which, caused by impurity, may in a disagreeable sense affect others, and murder. All these were acts considered of the highest importance under the monarchy, but they are quite so serious in a republican state. That is what we are going to analyze with the aid of philosophy's torch, for by its like alone may such an inquiry be undertaken. Let no one tax me with being a dangerous innovator. Let no one say that by my writings I seek to blunt the remorse in evildoers' hearts, that my humane ethics are wicked because they augment those same evildoers' penchant for crime. I wish formally to certify here and now that I have none of these perverse intentions. I set forth the ideas which, since the age when I first began to reason, have identified themselves in me, and to whose expression and realization the infamous despotism of tyrants has been opposed for uncounted centuries. So much the worse for those susceptible to corruption by any idea, so much the worse for them who fasten upon naught but the harmful in philosophic opinions, who are likely to be corrupted by everything. Who knows? They may have been poisoned by reading Seneca and Sharon. It is not to them I speak. I address only to people capable of hearing me out, and they will read me without any danger. It is with utmost candor I confess that I have never considered calumny an evil, and especially in a government like our own, under which all of us, bound closer together, nearer one to the other, obviously have a greater interest in becoming acquainted with one another. Either one or the other, calumny attaches to a truly evil man, or it falls upon a virtuous creature. It will be agreed that, in the first case, it makes little difference if one imputes a little more evil to a man known for having done a great deal of it. Perhaps, indeed, the evil which does not exist will bring to light evil which does. And there you have him, the malefactor, more fully exposed than ever before. We will suppose now that an unwholesome influence reigns over Hanover, but that in repairing to that city where the air is insalubrious, I risk little worse than a bout of fever. May I reproach the man who, to prevent me from going to Hanover, tells me that one perishes upon arriving there? No, surely not. For, by using a great evil to frighten me, he spared me a lesser one. If, on the contrary, a virtuous man is calumniated, let him not be alarmed. He need but exhibit himself, and all the calumniator's venom will soon be turned back upon the latter. For such a person, calumny is merely a test of purity, whence his virtue emerges more resplendent than ever. As a matter of fact, his individual ordeal may profit the cause of virtue in the Republic, and add to its sum. For this virtuous and sensitive man, stung by the injustice done him, will apply himself to this cultivation of still greater virtue. He will want to overcome this calumny, from which he thought himself sheltered, and his splendid actions will acquire a correspondingly greater degree of energy. Thus, in the first instance, the calumniator produces quite favorable results by inflating the vices of the dangerous object of his attacks. In the second, the results achieved are excellent. for virtue is obliged to offer itself to us entire. Well, now, I am at a loss to know for what reason the calumniator deserves your fear, especially under a regime where it is essential to identify the wicked, and to augment the energy of the good. Let us hence very carefully avoid any declarations prejudicial to calumny. We will consider it both a lantern and a stimulant, and in either case something highly useful. The legislator, all of whose ideas must be as large as the work he undertakes is great, must never be concerned with the effect of that crime which strikes only the individual. It is the general, overall effect he must study. And when in this manner he observes the effects calumny produces, I defy him to find anything punishable in it. I defy him to find any shadow or hint of justice in the law that would punish it. A legislator becomes the man of greatest justice and integrity if, on the contrary, he encourages and rewards it. Theft is the second of the moral offenses whose examination we proposed. If we glance at the history of ancient times, we will see theft permitted, nay, recompensed, in all the Greek republics. Sparta and Lacedaemon openly favored it. Several other peoples regarded it as a virtue in a warrior. It is certain that stealing nourishes courage, strength, skill, tact, in a word, all the virtues useful to a republican system and consequently to our own. Lay partiality aside, and answer me. Is theft, whose effect is to distribute wealth more evenly, to be branded as a wrong in our day, under our government, which aims at equality? Plainly, the answer is no. It furthers equality, and, what is more, renders more difficult the conservation of property. There was once a people who punished not the thief, but him who allowed himself to be robbed, in order to teach him to care for his property. This brings us to reflections of a broader scope. God forbid that I should here wish to assail the pledge to respect property the nation has just given. But will I be permitted some remarks upon the injustice of this pledge? What is the spirit of the vow taken by all a nation's individuals? Is it not to maintain a perfect equality amongst citizens? To subject them all equally to the law protecting the possessions of all? Well, I ask you now whether that law is truly just, which orders the man who has nothing to respect another who has everything. What are the elements of the social contract? Does it not consist in one's yielding a little of his freedom and of his wealth in order to assure and sustain the preservation of each? Upon those foundations all the laws repose. They justify the punishments inflicted upon him who abuses his liberty. In the same way, they authorize the imposition of conditions. These latter prevent a citizen from protesting when these things are demanded of him, because he knows that by means of what he gives, the rest of what he has is safeguarded for him. But once again, by what right will he who has nothing be enchained by an agreement which protects only him who has everything? If, by your pledge, you perform an act of equity in protecting the property of the rich, do you not commit one of unfairness in requiring this pledge of the owner who owns nothing? What advantage does the latter derive from your pledge? And how can you expect him to swear to something exclusively beneficial to someone who, through his wealth, differs so greatly from him? Certainly, nothing is more unjust. An oath must have an equal effect upon all the individuals who pronounce it, that it bind him who has no interest in its maintenance is impossible, because it would no longer be a pact amongst free men. It would be the weapon of the strong against the weak, against whom the latter would have to in incessant revolt. Well, such, exactly, is the situation created by the pledge to respect property the nation has just required all the citizens to subscribe to under oath. By it only the rich retain the poor. The rich alone benefit from a bargain into which the poor man enters so thoughtlessly, failing to see that through this oath, wrung from his good faith, he engages himself to do a thing that cannot be done with respect to himself. Thus conceived, as you might be, of this barbarous inequality, do not proceed to worsen your injustice by punishing the man who has nothing for having dared to filch something from the man who has everything. Your inequitable pledge gives him a greater right to it than ever. In driving him to perjury, by forcing him to make a promise which, for him, is absurd, you justify all the crimes to which this perjury will impel him. It is not for you to punish someone for which you have been the cause. I have no need to say more to make you to sense the terrible cruelty of chastising thieves. Imitate the wise law of the people I spoke of just a moment ago. Punish the man neglectful enough to let himself be robbed. But proclaim no kind of penalty against robbery. Consider whether your pledge does not authorize the act, and whether he who commits it does any more than put himself in harmony with the most sacred of nature's movements, that of preserving one's own existence at no matter whose expense. The transgressions we are considering in this second class of man's duties towards his fellows includes actions for whose undertaking libertinage may be the cause. Amongst those which are pointed to as particularly incompatible with approved behavior are prostitution, incest, rape, and sodomy. We surely must not for one moment doubt that all those known as moral crimes, that is to say, all acts of the sort to which those we have just cited belong, are of total inconsequence under a government whose sole duty consists in preserving, by whatever may be the means, the form essential to its continuance. There you have a republican government's unique morality. Well, the republic being permanently menaced from the outside by the despots surrounding it, the means to its preservation cannot be imagined as moral means, for the republic will preserve itself only by war, and nothing is less moral than war. I ask how one will be able to demonstrate that in a state rendered immoral by its obligations, it is essential that the individual be moral. I will go further. It is a very good thing he is not. The Greek lawgivers perfectly appreciated the capital necessity of corrupting the member citizens in order that, their moral dissolution coming to conflict with the establishment and its values, there would result the insurrection that is always indispensable to a political system of perfect happiness, which, like republican government, must necessarily excite the hatred and envy of all its foreign neighbors. Insurrection, thought these sage legislators, is not at all a moral condition. However, it has got to be a republic's permanent condition. Hence, it would be no less absurd than dangerous to require that those who are to ensure the perpetual immoral subversion of the established order themselves be moral beings. For the state of a moral man is one of tranquility and peace. The state of an immoral man is one of perpetual unrest that pushes him to and identifies him with the necessary insurrection in which the Republican must always keep the government of which he is a member. We may now enter into detail and begin by analyzing modesty, that faint-hearted negative impulse of contradiction to impure affections. Were it among nature's intention that man be modest, assuredly she would not have caused him to be born naked. Unnumbered peoples, less degraded by civilization than we, go about naked and feel no shame on that account. There can be no doubt that the custom of dressing has had its single origin in harshness of climate and the coquetry of women, who would rather provoke desire and secure to themselves its effects than have it caused and satisfied independently of themselves. They further reckoned that nature, having created them not without blemishes, they would be far better assured of all the means needed to please by concealing these flaws behind adornments. Thus, modesty, far from being a virtue, was merely one of the corruption's earliest consequences, one of the first devices of female guile. Lycurgus and Solon, fully convinced that her modesty's results are to keep the citizen in the immoral state indispensable to the mechanics of republican government, oblige girls to exhibit themselves naked at the theatre. Rome imitated the example. At the games of Flora they danced naked. The greater part of pagan mysteries were celebrated thus. Among some peoples, nudity even passed for a virtue. In any event, immodesty is born of lewd inclinations. What comes of these inclinations comprises the alleged criminality we are discussing, of which prostitution is the foremost effect. Now that we have gone back upon our feet, and broken with the host of prejudices that held us captive, now that, brought closer to nature by the quantity of prejudices we have recently obliterated, we listen only to nature's voice. We are fully convinced that if anything were criminal, it would be to resist the penchants she inspires in us, rather than come to grips with them. We are persuaded that lust, being a product of those penchants, is not to be stifled or legislated against, but that it is, rather, a matter of arranging for the means whereby passion may be satisfied in peace. We must hence undertake to introduce order into this sphere of affairs, and to establish all the security necessary so that, when need sends the citizen near the objects of lust, he can give himself over to doing with them all that his passions demand, without ever being hampered by anything. For there is no moment in the life of a man when liberty in its whole amplitude is so important to him. Various stations, cheerful, sanitary, spacious, properly furnished, and in every respect safe, will be erected in divers points in each city. In them, all sexes, all ages, all creatures possible will be offered to the caprices of the libertines who shall come to divert themselves. And the most absolute subordination will be the rule of the individuals participating. The slightest refusal or recalcitrance will be instantly and arbitrarily punished by the injured party. I must explain this last more fully, and weigh it against republican manners, I promised I would employ the same logic from beginning to end, and I shall keep my word. Although, as I told you just a moment ago, no passion has a greater need of the widest horizon of liberty than has this. None, doubtless, is as despotic. Here it is that man likes to command, to be obeyed, to surround himself with slaves compelled to satisfy him. Well, whenever you withhold from man the secret means whereby he exhales the dose of despotism nature instilled in the depths of his heart, he will seek other outlets for it. It will be vented upon nearby objects. It will trouble the government. If you would avoid that danger, permit a free flight, and rein to those tyrannical desires which, despite himself, torment man ceaselessly. Content with having been able to exercise his small dominion in the middle of the harem of sultanas and youths, whose submission your good offices and his money procure for him, he will go away appeased, and with nothing but fond feelings for a government which so obligingly affords him every means of satisfying his concupiscence. Proceed, on the other hand, after a different fashion. Between the citizen, those objects of public lust raise the ridiculous obstacles in olden times, invented by ministerial tyranny and by the lubricity of our Sardanapalises. Do that, and the citizen, soon embittered against your regime, soon jealous of the despotism he sees you exercise all by yourself, will shake off the yoke you lay upon him, and, weary of your manner ruling, will, as he has just done, substitute another for it. But observe how the Greek legislators, thoroughly imbued with these ideas, treated debauchery at Lacedaemon, at Athens. Rather than prohibiting, they salted the citizen on it. No species of lechery was forbidden him. And Socrates, whom the oracle described as the wisest philosopher of the land, passing indifferently from Aspasia arms into those of Alcibiades, was not on that account less the glory of Greece. I am going to advance somewhat further, and however contrary are my ideas to our present customs, as my object is to prove that we must make all haste to alter those customs if we wish to preserve the government we have adopted, I am going to try to convince you that the prostitution of women who bear the name of honest is no more dangerous than the prostitution of men, and that not only must we associate women with the lecheries practiced in the houses I have set up, but we must even build some for them, where their whims and the requirements of their temper, ardent like ours, but in a quite different way, may too find satisfaction with every sex. First of all, what right have you to assert that women ought to be exempted from the blind submission to men's caprices nature dictates? And secondly, by what other right do you defend their subjugation to a continence impossible to their physical structure, and of perfect uselessness to their honor? I will treat each of these questions separately. It is certain, in a state of nature, that women are born vogivagus, that is to say, are born enjoying the advantages of other female animals, and belonging, like them and without exception, to all males. Such were, without any doubt, both the primary laws of nature, and the only institutions of those earliest societies into which men gathered. Self-interest, egoism, and love degraded these primitive attitudes, at once so simple and so natural. One thought oneself enriched by taking a woman to wife, and with her the goods of her family, There we find satisfy the first two feelings I have just indicated. Still more often, this woman was taken by force. Nearby, one became attached to her. There we find the other of the motives of an action, and in every case, injustice. Never may an act of possession be exercised upon a free being. The exclusive possession of a woman is no less unjust than the possession of slaves. All men are born free. All have equal rights. Never should we lose sight of those principles, according to which never may be there granted to one sex the legitimate right to lay monopolizing hands upon the other. And never may one of these sexes or classes arbitrarily possess the other. Similarly, a woman existing in the purity of nature's laws cannot allege, as justification for refusing herself to someone who desires her, the love she bears another, because such a response is based upon exclusion. And no man may be excluded from the having of a woman as the moment it is clear she definitely belongs to all men. The act of possession can only be exercised upon a chattel or an animal, never upon an individual who resembles us. And all the ties which can bind a woman to a man are quite as unjust as illusory. If then it becomes incontestable that we have received from nature the right indiscriminately to express our wishes to all women, it likewise becomes incontestable that we have the right to compel their submission. Not exclusively, for I should then be contradicting myself, but temporarily. It cannot be denied that we have the right to decree laws that compel woman to yield to the flames of him who would have her. Violence itself being one of that right's effects. We could employ it lawfully. Indeed, has nature not proven that we have that right, by bestowing upon us the strength needed to bend women to our will? It is in vain women seek to bring to their defense either modesty or their attachment to other men. These illusory grounds are worthless. Earlier, we saw how contemptible and factitious is the sentiment of modesty. Love, which may be termed the soul's madness, is no more title by which their constancy may be justified. Love, satisfying two persons only, the beloved and the loving, cannot serve the happiness of others. And it is for the sake of the happiness of everyone, and not for an egotistical and privileged happiness, that women have been given to us. All men, therefore, have an equal right of enjoyment of all women. Therefore, there is no man who, in keeping with natural law, may lay claim to a unique and personal right over a woman. The law which will oblige them to prostitute themselves, as often and in any manner we wish, in the houses of debauchery we referred to a moment ago, and which will coerce them if they balk, punish them if they shirk or dawdle, is thus one of the most equitable of laws, against which there can be no sane or rightful complaint. A man who would like to enjoy whatever woman or girl will henceforth be able, if the laws you promulgate are just, to have her summoned at once to duty at one of the houses, and there, under the supervision of the matrons of that temple of Venus, she will be surrendered to him, to satisfy, humbly and with submission, or the fancies in which he will be pleased to indulge with her, however strange or regular they may be, since there is no extravagance which is not in nature, none which she does not acknowledge as her own. There remains but to fix woman's age now. Now I maintain it cannot be fixed without restricting the freedom of a man who desires a girl of any given age. He who has the right to eat the fruit of a tree may assuredly pluck it ripe or green, according to the inspiration of his taste. But it will be objected. There is an age when the man's proceedings would be decidedly harmful to the girl's well-being. This consideration is utterly without value. Once you concede me the proprietary right of enjoyment, that right is independent of the effects enjoyment produces. From this moment on, it becomes one. Whether this enjoyment be beneficial or damaging to the object which must submit itself to me. Have I not already proven that it is legitimate to force the woman's will in this connection? And that immediately she excites the desire to enjoy, she has got to expose herself to this enjoyment, putting all egotistical sentiments quite aside. The issue of her well-being, I repeat, is irrelevant. As soon as concern for this consideration threatens to detract from or enfeeble the enjoyment of him who desires her, and who has the right to appropriate her, this consideration for age ceases to exist. For what the object may experience, condemned by nature, and by the law to slake momentarily the other's thirst, is nothing to the point. In this study, we are only interested in what agrees with him who desires. But we will redress the balance. Incontestable rights to the enjoyment of her. I have the right to force from her this enjoyment. If she refuses me, it for whatever the cause may be. Yes, we will redress it. Doubtless we ought to. These women we have just so cruelly enslaved. There is no denying we must recompense them. And I come now to the second question I propose to answer. If we admit, as we have just done, that all women ought to be subjugated to our desires, we may certainly allow them ample satisfaction of theirs. Our laws must be favorable to their fiery temperament. It is absurd to locate both their honor and their virtue in the anti-natural strength they employ to resist the penchants with which they have been far more profusely endowed than we. This injustice of manners is rendered more flagrant, since we contrive at once to weaken them by seduction, and then to punish them for yielding to all the efforts we have made to provoke their fall. All the absurdity of our manners, it seems to me, is graven in this shocking paradox. And this brief outline alone ought to awaken us to the urgency of exchanging them for manners more pure. I say, then, that women, having been endowed with considerably more violent penchants for carnal pleasure than we, will be able to give themselves over to it wholeheartedly, absolutely free of all encumbering hymeneal ties, of all false notions of modesty, absolutely restored to a state of nature. I want laws permitting them to give themselves to as many men as they see fit. I would have them accorded the enjoyment of all sexes, and, as in the case of men, the enjoyment of all parts of the body. And under the special clause prescribing the surrender to all who desire them, There must be subjoined another guaranteeing them a similar freedom to enjoy all they deem worthy to satisfy them. What? I demand to know what dangers are there in this license? Children who will lack fathers? Ha! What can that matter in a republic where every individual must have no other dam than the nation, where everyone born is the motherland's child? And how much more they will cherish her, they who, never having known any but her, will comprehend from birth that it is from her alone all must be expected. Do not suppose you are fashioning good republicans so long as children, who ought to belong solely to the republic, remain immured in their families. By extending to the family, to a restricted number of persons, the portion of affection they ought to distribute amongst their brothers, they inevitably adopt those persons' sometimes very harmful prejudices. Such children's opinions, their thoughts are particularized, malformed, and the virtues of a man of the state become completely inaccessible to them. Finally, abandoning their heart altogether by those whom they have been given breath, they have no devotion left for what will cause them to mature, to understand, and to shine, as if these latter blessings were not more important than the former. If there is the greatest disadvantage in thus letting children imbibe interests from their family, often in sharp disagreement with those of their country, there is then the most excellent argument for separating them from their family. And are they not naturally weaned away by the means I suggest, since in absolutely destroying all marital bonds, they are no longer born, as fruits of the woman's pleasure, anything but children to whom knowledge of their father is absolutely forbidden? And with that the possibility of belonging to only one family, instead of being, as they must be, purely les enfants de la patrie. There will then be houses intended for women's libertinage, and like the men's, under the government's protection. These establishments there will be furnished to all the individuals of either sex women could desire, and the more constantly they frequent these places, the higher they will be esteemed. There is nothing so barbarous or so ludicrous as to have identified their honor and their virtue with the resistance women show the desire nature's implants in them, and which continually inflame those who are hypocrite enough to pass censure on them. From the most tender age, a girl released from her paternal fetters, no longer having anything to preserve from marriage, completely abolished by the wise laws I advocate, and superior to the prejudices which in former times imprisoned her sex, will therefore, in the houses created for the purpose, be able to indulge in everything to which her constitution prompts her. She will be received respectfully, copiously satisfied, and, returned once again into society, she will be able to tell of the pleasures she had tasted quite as publicly as today she speaks of a ball or promenade. Oh, charming sex, you will be free. As do men, you will enjoy all the pleasures of which nature makes a duty. From not one will you be withheld. Must the diviner half of humankind be laden with irons by the other? Ah, break those irons. Nature wills it. For a bridle have nothing but your inclinations. For laws only your desires. For morality, nature's alone. Languish no longer under brutal prejudices, wither your charms and hold captive the divine impulses of our hearts. Like us, you are free. The field of action whereon one contends for Venus's favors is as open to you as it is to us. Have no fear of absurd reproaches. Pedantry and superstition are things of the past. No longer will you be seen to blush at your charming delinquencies, crowned with myrtle and roses. The esteem we conceive for you will be henceforth in direct proportion to the scale you give your extravagances. What has just been said ought doubtless to dispense us from examining adultery. Nevertheless, let's cast a glance upon it. However non-existent it be in the eyes of the laws I am establishing, to what point was it not ridiculous in our former institutions to consider adultery criminal? Was there anything absurd in the world? Very surely it is the timelessness ascribed to conjugal relations. It appears to me it is necessary but to scrutinize, or sense the weight of those bonds, in order to cease to view as wicked the act which lightens them. Nature, as we remarked recently, having supplied woman with a temper more ardent, with a sensibility more profound, than she awarded persons of the other sex, it is unquestionably for women that the marital contract proves more onerous. Tender women, you ablaze with love's fire. Compensate yourselves now, and do so boldly and unafraid. Persuade yourself that there can exist no evil in obedience to nature's promptings, that it is not for one man she created you, but to please them all, without discrimination. Let no anxiety inhibit you. Imitate the Greek republicans. Never did the philosophers, whence they had their laws, contrive to make adultery a crime for them, and nearly all authorized disorderliness among women. Thomas More proves in his Utopia that it becomes women to surrender themselves to debauchery, and that great man's ideas were not always pure dreams. Amongst the Tartars, the more profligate a woman, the more she was honored. About her neck she publicly wore a certain jewelry attesting to her impudicity. And those who were not at all decorated were not at all admired. In Peru, families see their wives and daughters to the visiting traveler. They are rented at so much the day, like horses or carriages. Volumes, finally, would not suffice to demonstrate that lewd behavior has never been held criminal amongst the illuminated peoples of the earth. Every philosopher knows full well it is solely to the Christian impostors we are indebted for having puffed it up into crime. The priests had excellent cause to forbid us lechery. This injunction, by reserving to them acquaintance with and absolution for these private sins, gave them an incredible ascendancy over woman, and opened up to them a career of lubricity whose scope knew no limits. We know only too well how they took advantage of it, and how they would again abuse their powers, were they not hopelessly discredited. Is incest more dangerous? Hardly. It loosens family ties, and the citizen has that much more love to lavish on his country. The primary laws of nature dictate it to us. Our feelings vouch for the fact. And nothing is so enjoyable as an object we have coveted over the years. The most primitive institutions smiled upon incest. It is found in society's origins. It was consecrated in every religion. Every law encouraged it. If we traverse the world, we will find incest everywhere established. The blacks of the Ivory Coast and Gabon prostitute their wives to their own children. In Judah, the eldest son must marry his father's wife. The people of Chile lie indifferently with their sisters, their daughters, and marry mother and daughter at the same time. I would venture, in a word, that incest ought to be every government's law. Every government whose basis is fraternity. How is it that reasonable men were able to carry absurdity to the point of believing that the enjoyment of one's mother, sister, or daughter could ever be criminal? Is it not, I ask, an abominable view wherein it is made to appear a crime for a man to place higher value upon the enjoyment of an object to which natural feeling draws him close? One might just as well say that we are forbidden to love too much the individual's nature enjoins us to love best, and that the more she gives us hunger for some object, the more she orders us away from it. These are absurd paradoxes. Only people bestialized by superstition can believe or uphold them. The community of women I am establishing necessarily leading to incest, there appears little more to say about a supposed misdemeanor whose inexistence is too plainly evident to warrant further pursuit of the matter, and we shall turn our attention to rape, which at first glance seems to be, of all libertinage's excesses, the one which is most dearly established as being wrong, by reason of the outrage it appears to cause. It is certain, however, that rape, an act so very rare and so very difficult to prove, wrongs one's neighbor less than theft, since the latter is destructive to property, the former merely damaging to it. Beyond that, what objections have you to the ravisher? What will you say when he replies to you that, as a matter of fact, the injury he has committed is trifling indeed, since he has done no more than place a little sooner the object he has abused in the very state in which she would soon have been put by marriage and love? Ha 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 ha! But sodomy, that alleged crime which will draw the fire of heaven upon cities addicted to it, is sodomy not a monstrous deviation whose punishment could not be severe enough? Ah, sorrowful it is to have to reproach our ancestors for the judiciary murders in which, upon this head, they dared indulge themselves. We wonder that savagery could ever reach the point where you condemn to death an unhappy person, all of whose crime amounts to not sharing your taste. One shudders to think that scarce 40 years ago the legislators' absurd thinking had not evolved beyond this point. Console yourselves, citizens. Such absurdities are to cease. The intelligence of your lawmakers will answer for it. Thoroughly enlightened upon this weakness occurring in a few men, people deeply sense today that such error cannot be criminal, and that nature, who places such slight importance upon the essence that flows in our loins, can scarcely be vexed by our choice when we are pleased to vent it into this or that avenue. What single crime can exist here? For no one will wish to maintain that all parts of the body do not resemble each other, that there are some which are pure and others defiled. But, as it is unthinkable such nonsense be advanced seriously, the only possible crime would consist in the waste of semen. Well, is it likely that this semen is so precious to nature that its loss is necessarily criminal? Well, that's so. would she every day institute those losses? And is it not to authorize them, to permit them in dreams, to permit them in the act of taking one's pleasure with a pregnant woman? Is it possible to imagine nature having allowed us the possibility of committing a crime that would outrage her? Is it possible that she consent to the destruction by man of her own pleasures, and to his thereby becoming stronger than she? It is unheard of. Into what an abyss of folly one is hurled when, in reasoning, one abandons the aid of reason's torch. Let us abide in our unshakable assurance that it is as easy to enjoy a woman in one manner as in another. That it makes absolutely no difference whether one enjoys a girl or a boy, and as soon as it is clearly understood that no inclinations or tastes can exist in us save the ones we have from nature, that she is too wise and too consistent to have given us any which could ever offend her. The penchant for sodomy is the result of physical formation, to which we contribute nothing, and which we cannot alter. At the most tender age, some children reveal that penchant, and it is never corrected in them. Sometimes it is the fruit of satiety. But even in this case, is it less nature's doing? Rather, regardless of how it is viewed, it is her work, and, in every instance, what she inspires must be respected by men. If, were one to take an exact inventory, it should come out that this taste is infinitely more affecting than the other, that the pleasures resulting from it are far more lively, and that for this reason its exponents are 1,000 times more numerous than its enemies. Would it not then be possible to conclude that, far from affronting nature, this vice serves her intentions, and that she is less delighted by our procreation than we so foolishly believe? Why, as we travel about the world, how many peoples do we not see holding women in contempt? Many are the men who strictly avoid employing them for anything but having of the child necessary to replace them. The communal aspects of life in republics always renders this vice more frequent in that form of society, but it is not dangerous. Would the Greek legislators have introduced it into their republics had they thought it so? Quite the contrary. They deemed it necessary to a warlike race. Plutarch speaks with enthusiasm of the battalion of lovers. For many a year they alone defended Greece's freedom. The vice reigned amongst comrade in arms, and cemented their unity. The greatest of men leaned toward sodomy. At the time it was discovered, the whole of America was found inhabited by people of this taste. In Louisiana, amongst the Illinois, Indians in feminine garb prostituted themselves as courtesans. The blacks of Benguela publicly keep men. Nearly all the seraglios of Algiers are today exclusively filled with young boys. Not content to tolerate love for young boys, the Thebans made it mandatory. The philosopher of Chironea prescribed sodomy as the surest way to a youth's affection. We know to what extent it prevailed in Rome, where they had public places in which young boys, costumed as girls, and girls as boys, prostituted themselves. In their letters, Martial, Catullus, Tibullus, Horace, and Virgil wrote to men as though to their mistresses. And we read in Plutarch that women must in no way figure in men's love. The Amasians of Crete used to abduct boys, and their initiation was distinguished by the most singular ceremonies. When they were taken with love for one, They notified the parents upon what day the ravisher wished to carry him off. The youth put up some resistance if his lover failed to please him. In the contrary case, they went off together, and the seducer restored him to his family as soon as he had made use of him. For in this passion, as in that for women, one always has too much when one has had enough. Strabo informs us that on this very island, seraglios were peopled with boys only. They were prostituted openly. Is one more authority required to prove how useful this vice is in a republic? Let us lend an ear to Jerome, the peripatetic. The love of youth, says he, spreads throughout all of Greece, for it instilled in us courage and strength, and thus stood us in good stead when we drove the tyrants out. Conspiracies were formed amongst lovers, and they were readier to endure torture than denounce their accomplices. Such patriots sacrificed everything to the state's prosperity. It was beheld as a certain thing that these attachments steadied the republic. Women were declaimed against, and to entertain connections with such creatures was a frailty reserved to despots. Pederasty has always been the vice of warrior races. From Caesar, we learn that the Gauls were to an extraordinary degree given to it. The wars fought to sustain the republic brought about the separation of the two sexes, and hence the propagation of the vice. And when its consequences, so useful to the state, were recognized, religion speedily blessed it. That the Romans sanctified the amours of Jupiter and Ganymede is well known. Sextus Empiricus assures us that this caprice was compulsory amongst the Persians. At last, the women, jealous and contempt, offered to render their husbands the same service they received from young boys. Some few men made the experiment, and returned to their former habits, finding the illusion possible. The Turks, greatly inclined toward this depravity Mohammed consecrated in the Koran, were nevertheless convinced that a very young virgin could well enough be substituted for a youth. And rarely did they grow to womanhood without having passed through the experience. Sextus Quintus and Sanchez allowed this debauch. The latter even undertook to show it was of use to procreation, and that a child created after this preliminary exercise was infinitely better constituted thanks to it. Finally, women found restitution by turning to each other. This latter fantasy doubtless has no more disadvantages than the other, since nothing comes of the refusal to reproduce, and since the means of those who have a bent for reproduction are powerful enough for reproduction's adversaries never to be able to harm population. Amongst the Greeks, this female perversion was also supported by policy. The result of it was that, finding each sufficient, women sought less communication with men, and their detrimental influence in the Republic's affairs was thus held to a minimum. Lucian informs us of what progress this license promoted, and it is not without interest we see it exemplified in Sappho. In fine, these are perfectly inoffensive manias. Were women to carry them even further, were they to go to the point of caressing monsters and animals, as the example of every race teaches us, no ill could possibly result therefrom, because corruption of manners, often of prime utility to a government, cannot in any sense harm it. And we must demand wisdom and enough prudence of our legislators to be entirely sure that no law will emanate from them that would repress perversions which, being determined by constitution and being inseparable from physical structure, cannot render the person in whom they are present any more guilty than the person nature created deformed. In the second category of man's crimes against his brethren, there is left to us only murder to examine. And then we will move on to man's duties toward himself. Of all the offenses man may commit against his fellows, murder is, without question, the cruelest. Since it deprives man of the single asset he has received from nature, and its loss is irreparable. Nevertheless, at this stage several questions arise. Leaving aside the wrong murder does him who becomes its victim. 1. As regards the laws of nature only, is this act really criminal? 2. Is it criminal with what regards the laws of politics? 3. Is it harmful to society? 4. What must be a republican government's attitude toward it? 5. Finally, must murder be repressed by murder? Each of these questions will be treated separately. The subject is important enough to warrant thorough consideration. Our ideas touching murder may surprise for their boldness. But what does that matter? Have we not acquired the right to say anything? The time has come for the ventilation of great verities. Man today will not be content with less. The time has come for error to disappear. That blindfold must fall beside the heads of kings. From nature's point of view, is murder a crime? That is the first question posed. It is probable that we are going to humiliate man's pride by lowering him again to the rank of all of nature's other creatures. But the philosopher does not flatter small human vanities. Ever in burning pursuit of truth, he discerns it behind stupid notions of pride, lays it bare, elaborates upon it, and intrepidly shows it to the astonished world. What is man? And what difference is there between him and other plants, between him and all the other animals of the world? None, obviously. Fortuitously placed, like them, upon this globe, he is born like them. Like them, he reproduces, rises, and falls. Like them, he arrives at old age, and sinks like them into nothingness at the close of the lifespan nature assigns each species of animal, in accordance with its organic construction. Since the parallels are so exact that the inquiring eye of philosophy is absolutely unable to perceive any ground for discrimination, there is then just as much evil in killing animals as men, or just as little. And whatever be the distinctions we make, they will be found to stem from our pride's prejudices, than which, unhappily, nothing is more absurd. Let us all, the same, press on to the question. You cannot deny it is one and the same, to destroy a man or a beast, but is not the destruction of all living animals decidedly an evil, as the Pythagoreans believed, and as they who dwell on the banks of Ganges yet believe? Before answering that, we remind the reader that we are examining the question only in terms of nature and in relation to her. Later on, we will envisage it with reference to men. Now then, what value can nature set upon individuals whose making costs her neither the least trouble nor the slightest concern? The worker values his work according to the labor it entails and time spent creating it. Does man cost nature anything? And, under the supposition that he does he cost her more than an ape or an elephant? I go further. What are the regenerative materials used by nature? And what are composed the beings which come into life? Do not the three elements of which they are formed result from the prior destruction of other bodies? If all individuals were possessed of eternal life, would it not become impossible for nature to create any new ones? If nature denies eternity to beings, it follows that their destruction is one of her laws. Now, once we observe that destruction is so useful to her that she absolutely cannot dispense with it, and that she cannot achieve her creations without drawing from the store of destruction which death prepares for her, from this moment onward the idea of annihilation which we attach to death ceases to be real. There is no more veritable annihilation. What we call the end of the living animal is no longer a true fini, but a simple transformation, a transmutation of matter. What every modern philosopher acknowledges as one of nature's fundamental laws. According to these irrefutable principles, death is hence no more than a change of form, an imperceptible passage from one existence into another, and that is what Pythagoras called metempsychosis. These truths once admitted, I ask whether it can ever be proposed that destruction is a crime. Will you dare tell me, with the design of preserving your absurd illusions, that transmutation is destruction? No, surely not. For to prove that, it would be necessary to demonstrate matter inert for an instant, for a moment in repose. Well, you will never detect any such moment. Little animals are formed immediately a large animal expires, and these little animals' lives are simply one of the necessary effects determined by the large animal's temporary sleep. Given this, will you dare suggest that one pleases nature more than another? To support that contention, you would have to prove what cannot be proven. That elongated or square are more useful, more agreeable to nature than oval or triangular shapes. You would have to prove that, with what regards nature's sublime scheme, a sluggard who fattens in idleness is more useful than the horse, whose service is of such importance, or than a steer, whose body is so precious that there is no part of which it is not useful. You would have to say that the venomous serpent is more necessary than the faithful dog. Now, as not one of these systems can be upheld, one must hence consent unreservedly to acknowledge our inability to annihilate nature's works, in light of the certainty that the only thing we do when we give ourselves over to destroying is merely to effect an alteration in forms which does not extinguish life. It becomes beyond human powers to prove that there may exist anything criminal in the alleged destruction of a creature, of whatever age, sex, or species you may suppose it. Led still further in our series of inferences proceeding one from the other, we affirm that the act you commit in juggling the forms of nature's different productions is of advantage to her, since thereby you supply her the primary material for her reconstructions, task which would be compromised were you to desist from destroying. Well, let her do the destroying, they tell you. One ought to let her do it, of course, but they are nature's impulses man follows when he indulges in homicide. It is nature who advises him, and the man who destroys his fellow is to nature what are the plague and the famine. Like them, sent by her hand, which employs every possible means more speedily to obtain of destruction this primary matter, itself absolutely essential to her works. Let us deign for a moment to illumine our spirits by philosophy's sacred flame. What other than nature's voice suggests to us personal hatreds, revenges, wars, in a word, all those causes of perpetual murder? Now, if she incites us to murderous acts, she has need of them. At once grasped, how may we suppose ourselves guilty in her regard, when we do nothing more than obey her intentions? But that is more than what is needed to convince any enlightened reader, that for murder ever to be an outrage to nature is impossible. Is it a political crime? We must avow, on the contrary, that it is, unhappily, really one of policy's and politics' greatest instruments. Is it not by dint of murders that France is free today? Needless to say, here we are referring to the murders occasioned by war, not to the atrocities committed by plotters and rebels. The latter, destined to the public's execration, have only to be recollected to arouse forever general horror and indignation. What study, what science, has greater need of murder's support than that which tends only to deceive, whose sole end is the expansion of one nation at another's expense? Are wars, the unique fruit of this political barbarism, anything but the means whereby a nation is nourished, whereby it is strengthened, whereby it is buttressed? And what is war if not the science of destruction? The strange blindness in man, who publicly teaches the art of killing, who rewards the most accomplished killer, and who punishes him who for some particular reason does away with his enemy. Is it not high time errors so savage be repaired? Is murder then a crime against society? But how could that reasonably be imagined? What difference does it make to this murderous society whether it have one member more or less? Will its laws, its manners, its customs be vitiated? Has an individual's death ever had any influence upon the general mass? And after the loss of the greatest battle, what am I saying? After the obliteration of half the world, or if one wishes, of the entire world, would the little number of survivors, should there be any, notice even the faintest difference in things? No, alas, no. Nor would nature notice any either. And the stupid pride of man, who believes everything created for him, would be dashed indeed, after the total extinction of the human species, were it to be seen that nothing in nature had changed, and that the star's flight had not for that been retarded. Let us continue. What must the attitude of a warlike and republican state be toward murder? Dangerous, it should certainly be, either to cast discredit upon the act, or to punish it. Republican mettle calls for a touch of ferocity. If he grows soft, if his energy slackens in him, the Republican will be subjugated in a trice. A most unusual thought comes to mind at this point, but if it is audacious, it is also true, and I will mention it. A nation that begins by governing itself as a republic will only be sustained by virtues because, in order to attain the most, one must always start with the least. But an already old and decayed nation which courageously casts off its yoke of its monarchical government in order to adopt a republican one, will only be maintained by many crimes, for it is criminal already. And if it were to wish to pass from crime to virtue, that is to say, from a violent to a pacific, benign condition, it should fall into an inertia whose result would soon be its certain ruin. What happens to the tree when transplant from a soil full of vigor to a dry and sandy plain? All intellectual ideas are so greatly subordinate to nature's physical aspect that the comparisons supplied us by agriculture will never deceive us in morals. Savages, the most independent of men, the nearest to nature, daily indulge in murder, which amongst them goes unpunished. In Sparta, in Lacedaemon, they hunted helots, just as we in France go on partridge shoots. The freest of people are they who are most friendly to murder. In Mindanao, a man who wishes to commit a murder is raised to the rank of a warrior brave. He is straightway decorated with a turban. Amongst the Caraguos, one must have killed 7 men to attain the honors of this headdress. The inhabitants of Borneo still believe all those they put to death will serve them when they themselves depart life. Devout Spaniards made a vow to St. James of Galicia to kill a dozen Americans every day. In the kingdom of Tangut, there is selected a strong and vigorous young man. On certain days of the year, he is allowed to kill whomever he encounters. Was there ever a people better disposed to murder than the Jews? One sees it in every guise, upon every page of their history. Now and again, China's emperor and mandarins take measures to stir up a revolt amongst the people, in order to derive from these maneuvers the right to transform them into horrible slaughters. May that soft and effeminate people rise against their tyrants. The latter will be massacred in their turn, and with much greater justice. Murder, adopted always necessary, will have but changed its victims. It has been the delight of some, and will become the felicity of others. An infinite number of nations tolerates public assassinations. They are freely permitted in Genoa, Venice, Naples, and throughout Albania. At Cacoa, on the San Domingo River, murderers, undisguised and unashamedly, upon your orders and before your very eyes, cut the throat of the person you have pointed out to them. Hindus take opium to encourage themselves to murder, and then, rushing out into the street, they butcher everyone they meet. English travelers have found this idiosyncrasy in Batavia, too. What people were at once greater and more bloodthirsty than the Romans? And what nation longer preserved its splendor and freedom? The gladiatorial spectacles fed its bravery. It became warlike through the habit of making a game of murder. 12 or 1,500 victims filled the circus's arena every day. And there the women, crueler than the men, dared demand that the dying fall gracefully and be sketched while still in death's throes. The Romans moved from that to the pleasures of seeing dwarfs cut each other to pieces. And when the Christian cult, then infecting the world, came to persuade men there was an evil in killing one another, the tyrants immediately enchained that people, and everyone's heroes became their toys. Everywhere, in short, It was rightly believed that the murderer, that is to say, the man who stifled his sensibilities to the point of killing his fellow men, and of defying public or private vengeance, everywhere, I say, it was thought such a man could only be very courageous, and consequently very precious to a warlike or republican community. We may discover certain nations which, yet more ferocious, could only satisfy themselves by immolating children, and very often their own. And we will see these actions universally adopted, and upon occasion even made part of the law. Several savage tribes kill their children immediately they are born. Mothers, on the banks of the Orinoco, firm in the belief their daughters were born only to be miserable, since their fate was to become wives in this country where women were found insufferable, immolated them as soon as they were brought into the light. In Taprobane and in the kingdom of Sopit, all deformed children were immolated by their own parents. If their children are born on certain days of the week, the women of Madagascar expose them to wild beasts. In the republics of Greece, all the children who came into the world were carefully examined, and if they were found not to conform to the requirements determined by the republic's defense, they were sacrificed on the spot. In those days, it was not deemed essential to build richly furnished and endowed houses for the preservation of mankind's scum. Up until the transfer of the seat of the empire, all the Romans were not disposed to feed their offspring, flung them upon the dung heaps. The ancient legions had no scruple about condemning children to death, and never did one of their codes repress the rights of a father over his family. Aristotle urged abortion, and those ancient republicans, filled with enthusiasm, with patriotic fervor, failed to appreciate this commiseration for the individual person that one finds in modern nations. They love their children less, but their country more. In all the cities of China, one finds every morning an incredible number of children abandoned in the streets. A dung cart picks them up at dawn, and they are tossed into a moat. Often, midwives themselves disencumbered mothers by instantly plunging their issue into vats of boiling water, or by throwing it into the river. In Peking, infants were put into little reed baskets that were left on the canals. Every day, these canals were skimmed clean, and the famous traveler, de Halde, calculates as above 30,000 the number of infants collected in the course of each search. It cannot be denied that it is extraordinarily necessary, extremely politic, to erect a dike against overpopulation in a republican system, for entirely contrary reasons. The birth rate must be encouraged in a monarchy. There, the tyrants being rich only through the number of their slaves, they assuredly have to have men. But do not doubt for a moment that populousness is a genuine vice in a republican government. However, it is not necessary to butcher people to restrain it, as our modern Decemvirs used to say. It is but a question of not leaving it the means of extending beyond the limits its happiness prescribes. Beware of too great a multiplication in a race whose every member is sovereign, and be certain that revolutions are never but the effect of a too numerous population. If, for the state's splendor, you accord your warriors the right to destroy men, for the preservation of that same state grant also unto each individual the right to give himself over as much as he pleases, since this he may do without offending nature, to ridding himself of the children he is unable to feed, or to whom the government cannot look for assistance. In the same way, grant him the right to rid himself, at his own risk and peril, of all enemies capable of harming him, because the result of all these acts, in themselves of perfect inconsequence, will be to keep your population at a moderate size, and never large enough to overthrow your regime. Let the monarchists say a state is great only by reason of its extreme population. This state will be forever poor, if its population surpasses the means by which it can subsist, and it will flourish always if, kept trimly within its proper limits, it can make traffic of its superfluity. Do you not prune the tree when it has over many branches? And do not too many shoots weaken the trunk? Any system which deviates from these principles is an extravagance whose abuses would conduct us directly to the total subversion of the edifice we have just raised with so much trouble. But it is not at the moment the man reaches maturity. One might destroy him in order to reduce population. It is unjust to cut short the days of a well-shaped person. It is not unjust, I say, to prevent the arrival in the world of a being who will certainly be useless to it. The human species must be purged from the cradle. What you foresee as useless to society is what must be stricken out of it. There you have only the reasonable means to the diminishment of a population, whose excessive size is, as we have just proven, the source of certain trouble. The time has come to sum up. Must murder be repressed by murder? Surely not. Let us never impose any other penalty upon the murderer than the one he may risk from the vengeance of the friends or family of him he has killed. I grant you pardon, said Louis XV to Charolais, who, to divert himself, had just killed a man. But I also pardon whoever will kill you. All the basis of the law against murderers may be found in that sublime motto. Briefly, murder is a horror, but an often necessary horror, never criminal, which it is essential to tolerate in a republican state. I have made it clear. The entire universe has given an example of it. But ought it be considered a deed to be punished by death? They who respond to the following dilemma will have answered the question, is it or is it not a crime? If it is not, why make laws for its punishment? And if it is, by what barbarous logic do you, to punish it, duplicate it by another crime? We have now but to speak of man's duties toward himself. As the philosopher only adopts such duties in the measure they conduce to his pleasure or to his preservation, it is futile to recommend their practice to him. Still more futile to threaten him with penalties if he fails to adopt them. The only offense of this order man can commit is suicide. I will not bother demonstrating here the imbecility of the people who make of this act a crime. Those who might have any doubts upon the matter are referred to Rousseau's famous letter. Nearly all early governments, through policy or religion, authorized suicide. Before the Areopagites, the Athenians explained their reasons for self-destruction. Then they stabbed themselves. Every Greek government tolerated suicide. It entered into the ancient legislators' scheme. One killed oneself in public, and one made of one's death a spectacle of magnificence. The Roman Republic encouraged suicide. It also greatly celebrated instances of devotion to country while nothing other than suicides. When Rome was taken by the Gauls, the most illustrious senators consecrated themselves to death. As we imitate that spirit, we adopt the same virtues. During the campaign of 92, a soldier, grief-stricken to find himself unable to follow his comrades to the Gemapi's affair, took his own life. Keeping ourselves at all times to the high standard of those proud republicans, we will soon surpass their virtue. It is the government that makes the man. Accustomed for so long to despotism, our courage was utterly crippled. Despotism depraved our manners. We are being reborn. It will shortly be seen of what sublime actions the French genius and character are capable when they are free. Let us maintain, at the price of our fortunes and our lives, this liberty, which has already cost us so many victims, of whom we regret not one if we attain our objective. Every one of them sacrificed himself voluntarily. Let us not permit their blood to have been shed in vain. But union. Or we will lose the fruit of all our struggles. Upon the victories we have just achieved, let us seat excellent laws. Our former legislators, still slaves of the despot we have just slaughtered, have given us nothing but laws worthy of that tyrant they continue to reverence. Let us redo their work. Let us consider that it is at last for republicans we are going to labor. May our laws be gentle. Like the people, they must rule. In pointing out, as I have just done, the nullity, the indifference of an infinite number of actions our ancestors, seduced by a false religion, beheld as criminal, I reduce our labor to very little. Let us create few laws, but let them be good, rather than multiplying hindrances. It is purely a question of giving an indestructible quality to the law we employ, of seeing to it that the laws we promulgate have, as ends, nothing but the citizens' tranquility, his happiness, and the glory of the Republic. But, Frenchmen, after having driven the enemy from your lands, I should not like your zeal to broadcast your principles to lead you further afield. It is only with fire and steel you will be able to carry them to the four corners of the earth. Before taking upon yourselves such resolutions, remember the unsuccess of the Crusades. When the enemy will have fled across the Rhine, heed me, guard your frontiers, and stay at home behind them. Revive your trade, restore energy and markets to your manufacturing, cause your arts to flourish again, encourage agriculture, both so necessary in a government such as yours, and whose aim must be to provide for everyone without standing in need of anyone. Leave the thrones of Europe to crumble of themselves. Your example, your prosperity, will soon send them flying, without your having to meddle in the business at all. Invincible within, and by your administration and your laws, a model to every race, there will not be a single government which will not strive to imitate you, not one which will not be honored by your alliance. But if, for the vain glory of establishing your principles outside your country, you neglect to care for your own felicity at home, despotism, which is no more than asleep, will awake. You will be rent by intestine disorder. You have exhausted your monies and your soldiers, and all that to return to kiss the manacles, the tyrants who will have subjugated you during your absence will impose upon you. All you desire may be wrought without leaving your home. Let other people observe you happy, and they will rush to happiness by the same road you have traced for them. Eugenie, tout le monde sait.
Now, it strikes me as a very solidly composed document that one, and it seems to me in such close agreement with your principles, at least with many of them, that I should be tempted to believe you its author.
Indeed, my thinking does correspond with some part of these reflections, and my discourses, they've proven it to you, even lend to what has just been read to us the appearance of a repetition.
That I did not notice. Wise and good words cannot be too often uttered. However, I find several amongst these principles a trifle dangerous.
In this world, there is nothing dangerous but pity and beneficence. Goodness is never but a weakness of which the ingratitude and impertinence of a feeble always force honest folk to repent. Let a keen observer calculate all of pity's dangers, and let him compare them with those of a staunch, resolute severity, and he will see whether the former are not the greater. But we are straying, Eugenie, in the interests of your education. Let's compress all that has just been said into this single word of advice. Never listen to your heart, my child. It is the most untrustworthy guide we have received from nature. With greatest care, close it up to misfortune's fallacious accents. Far better for you to refuse a person whose wretchedness is genuine than to run the risk of giving it to a bandit, to an intriguer, or to a cabaret. The one is of very slight importance, the other may be of the highest disadvantage. Le Chevalier.
May I be allowed to cast a glance upon the foundations of de Moncey's principles? For I would like to try to annihilate them, and may be able to... how different they would be, cruel man, if, stripped of the immense fortune which continually provides you with the means to gratify your passions, you were to languish a few years in that crushing misfortune out of which your ferocious mind dares to fashion notes wherewith to lash the wretched. Cast the pitying look upon them, and stifle not your soul to the point where the piercing cries of need should never more be heard by you. When your frame, weary from naught in pleasure, but pleasure, languorously reposes upon swan's down couches, look ye at those others, wasted by the drudgeries that support your existence, and at their bed, scarcely more than a straw for protection against the rude earth whereof like beasts. They have nothing but the chill crust to lie down upon. Cast a glance at them while surrounded by succulent meats, wherewith every day 20 of Comusi's students await your sensuality. Cast a glance, I say, at those wretches in yonder wood, disputing with wolves the dry soil's bitter root. When the most affecting objects of Cytherea's temple are with games, charms, laughter led to your impure bed, consider that poor luckless fellow stretched out near his grieving wife, content with the pleasures he reaps at the breast of tears. He does not even suspect the existence of others. Look ye at him when you are denying yourself nothing, when you are swimming in the midst of glut, in a sea of surfeit. Behold him, I say, doggedly lacking in the basic necessities of life. Regard his disconsolate family, his trembling wife, who tenderly divides herself between the cares she owes her husband languishing near her, and those nature enjoins for love's offspring, deprives of the possibility to fulfill any of those duties so sacred unto her sensitive heart. If you can do it, without a tremor, hear her beg of you the leavings your cruelty refuses her. Barbaric one, are these not at all human beings like you? And if they are of your kind, why should you enjoy yourself when they lie dying? Eugenie, never slay the sacred voice of nature in your breast. It is to benevolence it would direct you despite yourself when you extricate it from out of the fire of passions that absorb it, the clear tenor of nature. Leave religious principles far behind you. Very well, I approve it, but abandon not the virtue sensibility inspires in us. 'Twill never be but by practicing them we will taste the sweetest, the most exquisite of the soul's delights. A good deed will buy pardon for all your mind's depravities. It will soothe the remorse your misconduct will bring to birth, and, forming in the depths of your conscience a sacred asylum whereunto you will sometimes repair, you will find there consolation for the excesses into which your errors will have dragged you. Sister, I am young, yes, I am libertine, impious, I am capable of every mental obscenity, but my heart remains to me. It is pure, and, my friends, it is with it I am consoled for the irregularities of this my age.
Yes, Chevalier. You are young. Your speeches illustrate it. You are wanting in experience. The day will come, and I await it, when you will be seasoned. Then, my dear, you will no longer speak so well of mankind, for you will have its acquaintance. 'Twas men's ingratitude dried out my heart, their perfidy which destroyed in me those baleful virtues for which, perhaps, like you, I was also born. Now, if the vices of the one establish these dangerous virtues in the other, is it not then to render youth a great service when one throttles those virtues in youth at an early hour? Oh, my friend, how you do speak to me of remorse! Can remorse exist in the soul of him who recognizes crime in nothing? Let your principles weed it out of you if you dread its sting. Will it be possible to repent of an action with whose difference you are profoundly penetrated? When you no longer believe evil anywhere exists, of what evil will you be able to repent?
It is not from the mind remorse comes, rather, 'tis the heart's issue, and never will the intellect's sophistries blot out the soul's impulsions.
However, the heart deceives, because it is never anything but the expression of the mind's miscalculations. Allow the latter to mature, and the former will yield in good time. We are constantly led astray by false definitions when we wish to reason logically. I don't know what the heart is, not I. I only use the word to denote the mind's frailties. One unique flame sheds its light in me. When I am whole and well, sound and sane, I am never misled by it. When I am old, hypochondriacal, or pusillanimous, it deceives me, in which case I tell myself I am sensible. But in truth, I am merely weak and timid. Once again, Eugenie, I say it to you, be not abused by this perfidious sensibility. Be well convinced of it. It is nothing but the mind's weakness. One weeps, not save when one is afraid, and that is why kings are tyrants. Reject, spurn the Chevalier's insidious advice, in telling you to open your heart to all misfortunes and imaginary ills. He seeks to fashion for you a host of troubles, which, not being your own, would soon plunge you into an anguish, and that for no purpose. Ah, Eugenie, believe me when I tell you that the delights born of apathy are worth much more than those you get of your sensibility. The latter can only touch the heart in one sense. The other titillates and overwhelms all of one's being. In a word, is it possible to compare permissible pleasures with pleasures which, to far more piquant delights, join those inestimable joys that come of bursting socially imposed restraints and of the violation of every law?
You triumph, Domanse. The laurel belongs to you. The Chevalier's harangue did but barely brush my spirit. Yours seduces and entirely wins it over. Ah, Chevalier, take my advice. Speak rather to the passions than to the virtues when you wish to persuade a woman.
Madame de Saint-Ange to Chevalier.
Oh, yes, my friend. Fuck us, to be sure. But let us have no sermons from you. You'll not convert us, and you might upset the lessons with which we desire to saturate this charming girl's mind.
Upset? Oh, no. Your work is finished. What fools call corruption is by now firmly established enough in me to leave not even the hope of return. And your principles are far too thoroughly riven into my heart ever to be destroyed by the Chevalier's casuistries.
She is right. Let us not discuss it any longer. Chevalier, you would come off poorly in this debate, and we wish nothing from you but excellence.
So be it. We are met here for a purpose very different, I know, from the one I wish to achieve. Let's go directly to that destination. I agree with you. I save my ethics for others who, less besotted than you, will be in a better way to hear me.
Oh, yes, dear brother, yes. Exactly. Give us nothing but your fuck. We'll forego your morals. They are too gentle and mild for roues of our ilk.
I greatly fear, Damase, that this cruelty you recommend with such warmth may somewhat influence your pleasures. I believe I have already remarked something of the sort. You are hard when you take your pleasure, and I, too, might be able to confess to feelings, a few dispositions to viciousness. In order to clear my thoughts on the matter, please do tell me with what kind of an eye you view the object that served your pleasures.
As absolutely null. That is how I view it, my dear. Whether it does or does not share my enjoyment, whether it feels contentment or whether it doesn't, whether apathy or even pain, provided I am happy. The rest is absolutely the same to me.
Why? It is even preferable to have the object experience pain, is it not?
To be sure, 'tis much to be preferred. I have given you my opinion on the matter. This being the case, the repercussion within us is much more pronounced, and much more energetically and much more promptly launches the animal spirits in the direction necessary to voluptuousness. Explore the seraglios of Africa, those of Asia, or those others of southern Europe, and discover whether the masters of these celebrated harems are much concerned, when their pricks are in the air, about giving pleasure to the individuals they use. They give orders, and they are obeyed. They enjoy, and no one dares make them answer. They are satisfied, and the others retire. Amongst them are those who would punish, as a lack of respect, the audacity of partaking of their pleasure. The king of Akhaim pitilessly commands to be decapitated the woman who, in his presence, he has dared forget herself to the point of sharing his pleasure. And not infrequently the king performs the beheading himself. This despot, one of Asia's most interesting, is exclusively guarded by women. He never gives them orders, save by signs. The cruelest death is the reward reserved for her who fails to understand him, and the tortures are always executed either by his hand or before his eyes. All that, Eugenie, is founded entirely upon the principles I have already developed for you. What is it one desires when taking one's pleasure? That everything around us be occupied with nothing but ourselves? Think of naught but of us. Care for us only. If the objects we employ no pleasure to, you can be very sure they are less concerned for us than they are for themselves. And lo! Our own pleasure consequently disturbed. There is not a living man who does not wish to play the despot when he is stiff. It seems to him his joy is less when others appear to have as much as he. By an impulse of pride, very natural at this juncture, he would like to be the only one in the world capable of experiencing what he feels. The idea of seeing another enjoys as he enjoys reduces him to a kind of equality with that other, which impairs the unspeakable charm despotism causes him to feel. 'Tis false as well to say there is pleasure in affording pleasure to others, that is to serve them, and the man who is erect is far from desiring to be useful to anyone. On the contrary, by causing them hurt, he experiences all the charms a nervous personality relishes in putting its strength to use. 'Tis then he dominates, is a tyrant. And what a difference is there for the amour proper! Think not that it is silent during such episodes. The act of enjoyment is a passion, which, I confess, subordinates all others to it, but which simultaneously unites them. This desire to dominate at this moment is so powerful in nature that one notices it even in animals. See whether those in captivity procreate as do those others that are free and wild. The camel carries the matter further still. He will engender no more if he does not suppose himself alone. Surprise him, and, consequently, show him a master, and he will fly, will instantly separate himself from his companion. Had it not been nature's intent that man possesses this feeling of superiority, she would not have created him stronger than the being she destines to belong to him at those moments. The debility to which nature condemned woman incontestably proves that her design is for man, who then more than ever enjoys his strength, to exercise it in all the violent forms that suit him best, by means of tortures, if he be so inclined, or worse. Would pleasure's climax be a kind of fury? Were it not the intention of this mother of humankind that behavior during copulation be the same as behavior in anger? What well-made man, in a word, what man endowed with vigorous organs does not desire, in one fashion or in another, to molest his partner during his enjoyment of her? I know perfectly well that whole armies of idiots, who are never conscious of their sensations, will have much trouble understanding the systems I am establishing. But what do I care for these fools? 'Tis not to them I am speaking. Soft-headed women-worshippers. I leave them prostrate at the insolent Dulcinea's feet. There let them wait for the sighs that will make them happy, and basely, the slaves of the sex they are to dominate. I abandon them to the vile delights of wearing the chains wherewith nature has given them the right to overwhelm others. Let these beasts vegetate in the abjection which defiles them. 'Twould be in vain to preach to them. But let them not denigrate what they are incapable of understanding. And let them be persuaded that those who wish to establish the principles pertinent to this subject are only upon the free outbursts of a vigorous and untrammeled imagination, as do we, you, madame, and I. Those like ourselves, I say, will always be the only ones who merit to be listened to, the only ones proper to prescribe laws unto them, and to give lessons. God damn, I've got an erection! Get Augustin to come back here, if you please! The ring, he reappears. This amazing how this fine lad's superb ass does preoccupy my mind while I talk. All my ideas seem voluntarily to relate themselves to it. Show my eyes that masterpiece, Augustin. Let me kiss it and caress it. Oh, for a quarter of an hour. Hither, my love. Come, come, that I may, in your lovely ass, render myself worthy of the flames with which Sodom sets me aglow. He has the most beautiful buttocks, the whitest, I'd like to have Eugenie on her knees. She will suck his prick while I advance. In this manner, she will expose her ass to the Chevalier, who will plunge into it. And Madame de Santage, astride Augustine's back, will present her buttocks to me. I'll kiss them. Armed with the cat o' nine tails, she might surely, it should seem to me, by bending a little, be able to flog the Chevalier, who, thanks to this stimulating ritual, might resolve not to spare our student. The position is arranged. Yes, that's it, that's it. Let's do our best, my friends. Indeed, it is a great pleasure to commission you to execute tableaux. In all the world, there's not an artist fitter than you to realize them. This rascal does have a nipping tight ass. 'Tis all I can do to get a foothold in it. Would you do me the great kindness, madame, of allowing me to bite and pinch your lovely flesh while I'm at my fuckery?
Oh, as much as you like, my friend, but I warn you, I'm ready to take my revenge. I swear that for every vexation you give me, I'll blow a fart into your mouth.
By God, that is a threat. Quite enough to drive me to offend you, my dear. Ah! Well, let's see if we'll keep your word. Ah! Oh, fuck! Delicious! Delicious! Ah! Ah! Oh, 'tis divine, my angel! Save me a few for the critical moment, and be sure of it, I'll then treat you with the extremest cruelty. Most barbarously, I'll use you. Fuck! I can tolerate this no longer! Ah! I'll discharge! Ah! 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 Dost see how I deal with you, my fine fair bitch? How I dominate you once again here and there, and let the final insult be to the very idol at which I am sacrificed. And the rest of you, what have you been up to, my friends?
Oh, alas, my dear master, you see how your disciples have accommodated me. Oh, I have a mouthful of fuck and a half a pint in my ass. 'Tis all I am disgorging on both ends.
Hold there! I want you to deposit in my mouth what the Chevalier introduced into your behind.
Oh, what an extravagance!
There's nothing that can match fuck drained out of the depths of a pretty behind. 'Tis a food fit for the gods. Behold, 'tis neatly wiped up. Eh? He moves to Augustine's ass, which she kisses. Mwah! Mesdames, I am going to ask your permission to spend a few moments in a nearby room with this young man.
But can't you do here all you wish to do with him?
No. There are certain things which strictly require to be veiled.
Oh, by God, tell us what you be about.
I'll not allow him to leave if he does not.
You then wish to know?
Absolutely.
Very well, mesdames. I am going. But, indeed, it cannot be said.
Is there, do you think, any conceivable infamy we are not worthy to hear of and execute.
Wait, sister. I'll tell you.
Ooh, you are right. 'Tis hideous.
Why, I suspected as much. You see very well I had to be silent upon this caprice, and you grasp now that one must be alone and in the deepest shadow in order to give oneself over to such turpitudes.
Do you wish me to accompany you? I'll frig you while you amuse yourself with Augustine.
No. This is an affair d'honneur, and you should take place between men only. A woman would only disturb us. At your service in a moment, my dear ladies. He goes out, taking Augustine with him.